Today's show is sponsored by O'Reilly. O'Reilly is known for its animal books, which have helped tech professionals stay ahead for over 40 years. Today, its online learning platform at O'Reilly.com takes learning tech to the next level. Sure, your teams get access to thousands of books and videos, but there's also interactive learning, where they can get hands-on with tech like Kubernetes, Python, Docker, Java, and more in live dev environments. So they learn by doing, not just reading. With live online sessions, your teams learn from the biggest brains in AI, software architecture, cloud, data, programming, and more. They can even prep for tech certification exams with official materials and interactive practice tests. And then there's O'Reilly Answers. You just ask the search engine any tech question, and it takes you right to the best answers from O'Reilly's renowned books. It's why 66% of all Fortune 100 companies give their teams O'Reilly Online Learning. Get a demo today at O'Reilly.com. That's O'Reilly.com.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Another Sunday's Perspective show for you. Glad to be with you. And, I got to thinking this week, I saw two announcements that sort of got me thinking about, we've done a couple of shows on kind of look backs at some technology and what we've learned both from the technology evolution as well as some of the community and ecosystem evolution. And this week we saw two announcements that were sort of interesting, not at all coordinated, but sort of, triggered a couple things in my head, and I thought this might be a good topic to cover. The first one was we saw the Apache Foundation or the Apache Mesos project had decided basically to sort of put it on the shelf, decided to sort of stop maintaining that project. It was a project that, was originally started as an orchestrator, really focused around big data and analytics types of workloads. It eventually spawned and became Mesosphere, the company, which eventually became D2IQ. But at some point was really an interesting piece of technology, was really considered a good piece of technology, kind of limited, at least at the time, to big data, which I shouldn't say limited, that's a massive, massive space, but eventually sort of was overtaken by Kubernetes. The second one that I saw, which is really going to be the focus of today's Sunday's Perspective show, is that Solomon Hykes, who, for those of you that haven't been following the show for very long, or maybe haven't been around the community very long, was the founder of not only a company called dotCloud back in the PaaS days, back in the all the way back to 2008, 9, 10, when they started dotCloud. But he was also sort of more famously known as the person who created Docker, or at least was one of a couple of people who created Docker and then eventually first the Docker technology and then Docker the company. So I thought today what we would do is look at, kind of lessons we've learned from the evolution of that Docker technology and also kind of the ecosystem and communities that sprung up around the Docker project. We will, to a certain extent, have to sort of talk about Docker, Big D Docker, the company, but we're going to kind of try and separate those a little bit so it's not just about Docker. Anyways, I brought that up because Solomon sent out an email this week saying, hey, after about a 2-year hiatus and starting to raise a family, he was going to be starting a new company. So didn't really give any details about it, but it kind of got me thinking, okay, well, if he's sort of back in the game, maybe we should go back and look at what his first 2 rounds in the industry sort of look like in terms of the technologies and ecosystems around that technology, which eventually became known as Docker. So we'll get to that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Zesty. And Zesty wants to know if you've had enough with managing your AWS commitments. If it were only purchasing commitments, fine. But let's face it, the capacity planning, the back and forth, the ongoing optimization, choosing between 1-year, 3-year, savings plans, reserved instances, don't you want to just get back to being an engineer again? This is where Zesty comes in, a fully automated commitment management solution that achieves over 45% discounts on your EC2 with a 100% buyback guarantee. What does that mean? It means you'll never over-provision again. So join DevOps teams like Gong, Armis, Amdocs, WalkMe, and Firebolt, and be an engineer again while achieving the highest savings hands-free. Just go to zesty.co/savings to get your free potential savings evaluation. It takes no more than 5 minutes. That's zesty.co/savings. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dive into some of the lessons we can learn from the Docker project and the Docker ecosystem. Now, before we dive into this, I'm going to kind of clarify a couple of things, and this is sort of an important point, but it wasn't always obvious when these things were going on. Let me kind of provide a little bit of background first, a little bit of history lesson, and then we'll kind of dive into this. But there's a couple of important things to keep in mind. So, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, or at the top of the show, this company called dotCloud got started in 2008. Solomon Hykes was the founder. There was a couple of other founders at the time, and that was sort of the height or the beginning of this boom about PaaS, platform as a service, right? We're going to make things simpler for application developers. We're going to provide them all the things they need. We're going to get the infrastructure and the security out of the way, and you're just going to be able to run and scale applications, especially new applications. So, it was kind of the golden years for things like dotCloud and Heroku and Google App Engine. You had Cloud Foundry, which we talked about a few weeks ago, was starting up, which was closer to like 2011. You had things like OpenShift, the early versions of OpenShift around that same time, and you had a lot of really interesting ideas going on at the time. And unfortunately, most of those technologies in their incarnations didn't really work out. Heroku did get acquired by Salesforce, but for the most part, in the way that they were kind of built, didn't necessarily work out, and a lot of it had to do with it was good for developers, but it didn't give developers enough kind of into the guts of what they wanted. And there was always a weird fine line, a gray area of how much do you give developers, how much do you sort of hold back from them to make things easier. And the PaaS community sort of went through a lot of fits and starts trying to figure out what was right. Anyways, the reason I bring all that up was, there was this company called dotCloud, as I mentioned, and dotCloud was, not terribly successful, but again, not a lot of them were terribly successful. And one day at the PyCon event, the Python conference in 2013, Solomon got up and he said, I want to show you a new technology that dotCloud is creating. And in about a 5-minute demonstration, he said, let me show you this thing. It makes it far simpler to run essentially at the time what was Linux LXC and Linux cGroups, being able to bring them together and get applications up and running, all the dependencies of an application up and running like instantaneously. And so in 5 minutes, he sort of showed a hello world application, and the concept of Docker was born. And the idea of a container, a Linux container, was born, if you will, sort of the modern version of that. And the reason all that's sort of interesting is two things happened. First, dotCloud, essentially said, hey, we're exposing this technology that we're using under the covers, which most of the PaaS platforms at the time were using Linux containers under the covers, or LXC and cGroups under the covers. But it was complicated to make them work. And so they didn't have to expose that to developers. And so Solomon and at the time dotCloud were the first ones to really kind of expose that at a low level as a low level primitive, but kind of make it simple. And Docker was born. So Docker, the open source project, which I'm going to continue to call little d Docker throughout this talk, was born. And then a little while later, maybe a few months later, Docker, the company, was born. dotCloud rebranded themselves as Docker, capital D Docker. Docker Incorporated was born. And so you had two things going on. You had the Docker project, which was a fully open source project. And then you had Docker Incorporated, which was this commercial entity. And, at the time, it wasn't that big of a deal that things were the same name. They both were sort of evolving. The Docker, little d Docker community was growing like crazy, because all of a sudden people were like, wow, you made it so simple to take all my dependencies for an application. I can run them on any Linux. I can run them on my laptop. I can move them to a server. I can move them into the cloud. And so, all this consistency all of a sudden became available for developers. The ability to have, everything they needed in one, at the time, a Docker file, was super easy. And so, the open source community around this took off like crazy. I mean, thousands and thousands of people using the technology, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands and hundreds of developers contributing to the project. And so you had this really, really rich community built around Docker. And in some cases, the technology was used standalone. In some cases, it was embedded over the next couple of years into Linux operating systems like Red Hat Enterprise Linux and SUSE and Debian, and Docker, Big D Docker came out with their own version of this called Alpine. You had companies like CoreOS building entire operating systems that were specific for containers. So you had this explosion of things going on around the Docker, little d Docker community. And then you also had big D Docker running as a commercial entity. And that's where things started to get a little bit interesting because you had the conflict, which happens in every community between, how do you commercialize and monetize things in an open source community? And, how much flexibility does the community have? Now, let's go back a few years here. Keep in mind, this was around the time when the OpenStack Foundation, which we talked about several months ago, the foundation for that was starting to come along, right? This idea of like, hey, it's really hard when there's a lot of different vendors working on something to keep the thing neutral. That was just getting started. Things like the CNCF hadn't gotten started. Even things like the Cloud Foundry Foundation back in 2013, early 14 hadn't gotten started. And so, the idea of a benevolent dictator of around a popular project like, Linus Torvald had been with Linux was kind of an accepted thing. And at the time, Solomon basically said, hey, I am the, for lack of a better word, I'm the benevolent dictator for life of the Docker project. And this created some interesting relationships, if you will. Because what ended up happening was over time, as people began to really like Docker, they started to think about, okay, this thing could be the building block of a platform. And now you start to get people going, oh yeah, we're back in the mindset of building platforms again. Except Docker was different than the PaaS approach. PaaS was very sort of limiting on the number of languages. It was different in terms of, how could I orchestrate lots of containers together or ways of applications together? But at the end of the day, anybody who had lived through the PaaS days was like, hey, that approach, that mindset of let's make developers more productive was always in the back of people's mind. And so what we saw happen sort of in parallel was the Docker, little d Docker ecosystem start exploding. Tons and tons of companies were doing interesting things with containers, integrating into their technologies. And then the big Docker corporate company, Docker Incorporated, sort of started rebuilding a platform, if you will. Not necessarily a full PaaS with all the runtime capabilities, but they started making acquisitions. They started making it simpler for developers to build applications, compose applications, if you will. They started making it easier to build CI and CD systems that had integrated capabilities with containers. They had to start building things around how to secure these things, how to network them. And so you started to have these kind of conflicts being created, which was normal in any ecosystem, except the challenge in this ecosystem was that Docker, big D Docker, tended to put their thumb a little bit on the scale in terms of when new contributions came into the upstream project, into the open source project. And this created some tension, right? It created some tension sometimes for deployment models, what customers wanted to do, what other companies wanted to do. It also created some interesting challenges in terms of, was it the right architecture, right? Was the architecture going to have some flexibility? And one of the big things that came up very early on was CoreOS, I mentioned them earlier, essentially came up with an alternative runtime to a container runtime. And they said, hey, our focus as a company is to secure the internet. If you go back and listen to some things from Alex Polvey and Brendan Phillips and everybody when they started CoreOS, it was, we're trying to secure the internet. And so they came to the Docker community and they said, there needs to be a better security model for these container runtimes. And so they proposed an alternative. It was called Rocket or RKT. And so you had the Docker runtime and you had the Rocket runtime. And so this created sort of the first really major, I don't want to call it a fork, but kind of an aha moment for the community, right? Like, is Docker going to accept this? This is going to make some really big changes to the way that the Docker project runs today. And more importantly, like, who gets to dictate, who gets to drive the architecture of it? And so what ended up happening, there was a lot of sort of pushback initially. There was some back and forth. I put some links in the show notes to some shows that we did at the time, talking about the challenges in the community. But over time, this evolved, right? We saw the community come together. We saw both the Rocket community and the Docker community come together. They eventually created what was called the Open Container Initiative, or OCI. And this was great. It essentially said, we are going to build a standard runtime, what eventually became something called Run C. We're going to create the OCI standard, which says that anybody building a container image that's going to run on a set of runtimes, whatever those things might be, as long as they're Run C compatible, then they can run. And so, Docker kind of worked through that first kind of major hurdle of the ecosystem wants to do something very different than the commercial entity wants to do. But it did also kind of bring up a big issue for the community where they went, how are we going to resolve these things in the future? Because the number of innovations that come along isn't going to change. It's actually going to accelerate. There's going to be a lot more things that come along. And so you always had this sort of constant tension between, again, the company in charge, the benevolent dictator for the project and so forth, and this community that wanted to do more, right? It's not that they didn't like the Docker technology. They just wanted to do more. They wanted to take it in new directions. And again, some of those directions were going to be contrary to the sort of the commercial best interest or the commercial, main best practice architecture of Docker, Big D, Docker, the company. So they went through some things. The next big hurdle they went through was, people trying to figure out, well, how are they going to make money, right? The Big D company was in an interesting situation because about a year or so, 2 years into their, sort of life cycle, the press started writing really interesting articles that said things like, Docker and containers are going to become the new VMware. Essentially, they're going to become your new infrastructure. And this created a couple of kind of interesting and weird things. Number one was, Docker had started as .NET as a PaaS, trying to abstract the infrastructure. And now all of a sudden they were being mentioned as infrastructure again, which was kind of weird, right? They're down in the weeds. They're having to do networking and low-level security and integrating with storage. But also, it wanted to help developers because, helping developers is where the money was going to be at, right? You're going to help businesses do what they did. But you had all these articles being written that they were going to replace VMware. And one of the things that this did was it really shined a light on, how was Big D Docker going to monetize this technology, right? They were the dominant force in the fastest growing community in open source. How are they going to monetize it? And it became a very interesting scenario because at one point there was a lot of rumors, say 2016 timeframe, that Microsoft was going to acquire them. I'm sure they probably had a few different offers from different companies, but Microsoft had allegedly bid about $4 billion, allegedly, to acquire Docker. And you got to keep in mind at the time, that probably seemed like a lot of money, especially for a company who, had taken maybe $180 million in VC funding. So that would have been, a 20x exit for the company and for their VC partners. But the challenge at the time was VMware at the time was valued at about $22 billion. So if you were Docker and you were being told you're the next VMware and you're looking at the growth rates of your ecosystem compared to the growth rates even of VMware at the time, in terms of acquisition and usage and so forth, you had the advantage of like open source behind you, at least you thought you did. Boy, taking $4 billion when, the market you were going to replace was $22 billion probably seemed like you were leaving a lot of money on the table. So at the end of the day, they never did get acquired. They never did, or at least they didn't take money at that valuation. Now, the next big thing that happened was, Big D Docker was figuring out how much of a platform do we want to become? And this is where the orchestration wars took over. All right. So keep in mind, there really were two pieces that were going on here. The first one was standardizing that container runtime, standardizing how to use Linux containers. That was Docker. Docker really solved that problem. Again, it evolved a little bit. We saw different runtimes evolve out of it, but basically it solved that problem. But then the next one was, well, if I have lots of containers, how do I orchestrate these? And this is where things really went in different directions. Docker basically came along and said they took very much an Apple model. We want to have the most integrated offering. We want to have the cleanest offering. We want to have the best user experience. And they created something called Swarm. And Swarm was an orchestration capability, right? I talked about Mesos at the top of the show. We all know about Kubernetes. Swarm was sort of the third one in that three-legged stool, if you will, of what's possible. And Swarm was written very, very much to be Docker specific. It was, primarily built for the Docker runtime to integrate with all the Docker desktop tools, Docker Compose tools. And Docker, to a certain extent, was kind of trying to keep it to themselves. In fact, at one point, they tried to, bind together the runtime and the orchestration piece. And the challenge at the time was, even though they were considered to be a high-flying company and had taken $200 million in funding, Kubernetes now had some legs. This was in the late 2015, 2016 days. And all of a sudden you weren't just, competing against, VMware. It was against AWS and Azure and Google and Red Hat and a lot of people who were worth a lot more money than Docker was at the time. And they were all getting together on this alternative standard called Kubernetes. Now, we all know how the Kubernetes story has played out. It's sort of become the de facto way of doing it. But that was the second big challenge for the community was Docker wants us to go down the Swarm path. The community is going down the Kubernetes path. And in fact, the Kubernetes community at some point had so much struggle with the Docker technology, even though it was the first container technology, but it had so much struggle with it that it had to build specific interfaces to kind of abstract the container runtime. They were called CRI interfaces or container runtime interfaces. And again, this was another situation in which, the community kind of fragmented from the original little d Docker community into things that were going to better fit at the time the needs of businesses, the needs of their ecosystem, their shareholders, and so forth. So, by the time we got to about 2017, 2017, Kubernetes had really accelerated and taken off. It had taken off away from Swarm, away from Mesos and Marathon, and became the de facto scheduler. We now had a standard for the container runtime, which could be Docker, but could be other things as well. So Docker's influence at Big D Docker had sort of fallen away. They tried to go it alone for the most part. Again, as people would expect, they took a lot of VC funding. They were trying to, drive a lot of value for their investors and for themselves. And unfortunately, one of the lessons we learned is, the community became bigger than any one company within a space. So a lot went on. Eventually, Docker, the company, sort of restructured themselves. They sold off some of their technologies to Mirantis. They sort of recapitalized themselves, still under the Docker name, much more focused on the developer experience, desktop tools, still running Docker Hub. But things have very, very much changed between 2013 and, say, 2018 timeframe. And it's amazing. It's just a 5-year period. It's unbelievable how much changed within that 5-year period. So let me kind of, before we wrap up, I want to kind of go through a couple of things that I thought were sort of interesting lessons learned for the future. Right. So we talked a lot about the history lesson, how we got where we were, some of the things that Docker did really well, some of the things that Docker decisions they made that, maybe led to less success for them or what they expected. But fundamentally, containers were a fundamental building block. Nobody's ever going to take away from the work that Docker, the company, did to really change the industry. They deserve a lot of kudos and a lot of credit for really putting in one of the very, very fundamental things that have become a cornerstone of technologies, throughout our industry, not just, Kubernetes, but also, things happening at the edge, things happening in serverless. It's really, it's kind of very pervasive. It created a massive community of users. So the Docker project did. But unfortunately, Docker, the company, also frustrated a lot of their ecosystem partners. And so this is one of those, again, difficult learning things. But, there's always a fine line between not only not competing with your community, but realizing that your community is made up not just of end users, but also of ecosystem partners. And to a certain extent, in some cases, those ecosystem partners are going to help you grow your business. They're going to help you in adjacencies. But in some cases, they're going to sort of compete with you or co-opetition with you. And, that's a really difficult path to follow. It's a difficult, journey to sort of navigate. Folks probably looking back would sort of say, Docker was a little non-inclusive or, too self-looking in terms of some of the decisions that they made. One other thing that seems sort of small, but at the time was really a big deal, was sort of the conflict between a project name and the company name, right? I keep mentioning little d Docker and big D Docker. That confused a lot of people. Eventually, it confused people, especially as things started to get licensed. And, we saw the licensing go from being completely free to, Docker requiring that people, pay to include it in their Linux distributions, but also just little things like, them sending cease and desist letters to various companies because they had put down capital D Docker instead of lowercase d Docker on their website and so forth. So created some tension and some conflicts and maybe some unnecessary things. We've seen some companies that have been able to navigate that. Chef comes to mind, but Chef was original ops work. So, it is very difficult to separate when your name is exactly the same for the most part between your project and your company. So something to sort of keep in mind. The other thing, we've talked about this, really successful projects, successful ecosystems allow everybody to benefit. And, this is, if we look back, this is one of those areas where, Docker tried to maximize their revenue, tried to maximize their market share. You can't blame them for doing that. But I think, if they were to look back and say, hey, what could we have learned from somebody like Microsoft or somebody like Red Hat or somebody like even Amazon or anybody else who's been tremendously successful over the years, over a long period of time, it's, how they work with their ecosystem and realize that, you've got to find the right balance. And that probably is, maybe one of the things that, if you asked Solomon or Ben Golub or any of those folks, maybe what they could have gotten slightly different, that probably would have been one of those areas they looked at. And then finally, my last thought on this is, I think we're going to look back at this and sort of say that the Docker was probably the last software company to not monetize themselves through a significant sort of managed or SaaS cloud service, right? We've seen lots of software companies. We've seen lots of software companies now make that transition. We've seen Mongo and Confluent and Red Hat and VMware and many others who are making that transition from being a purely software company to having a viable cloud offering. Docker, just the timing of it was difficult. Number one, at the time when they got started, 2012, 2013, keep in mind, we've mentioned over and over again, Amazon didn't become $1 billion company until 2013, 2014. That cloud thing was still a very small piece of the market, especially for infrastructure PaaS things compared to what people were buying for on-premises. But the other thing is, by the time they started to compete against the cloud providers, they'd taken $200 million in funding, but $200 million is a drop in the bucket compared to competing against those folks who can do $200 million in a day in terms of investment. So, Docker is going to very much be, kind of a milestone on our highway of technology over the years. That was sort of one of the very, very last companies that could have been a great software company, but the industry was very much changing at the time away from purely software companies into, new, different evolved hybrid types of monetization models. And while they had a great model with Docker Hub, it was a great service. It wasn't something they were able to monetize at a big enough level. And so anyways, as we look back on it, Docker deserves a lot of kudos. The company, the group, the engineering team behind it deserves a lot of kudos for how they evolved the ecosystem. They probably would look back and have some regrets about, sort of how they also evolve the ecosystem in terms of, growing the pie for everybody as opposed to trying to take as much of the pie. So a lot of lessons learned, a lot of interesting history. I put a lot of links in the show notes for this one. Hopefully you enjoy kind of going back and looking through some of these things. And also, as you're thinking about how you work with ecosystems, how you're looking at companies and ecosystems and new companies that come along, whether you're looking at the lessons from OpenStack from a few months ago or Cloud Foundry from last month or Docker from this month, hopefully you're seeing some patterns in which you go, okay, there's some learning lessons in there. There's some things that we can take away from this, some things to do better, some things to do less. But it's also really interesting to see over these last 6-7 years, if you will, just how much change has happened in the ecosystem and how fast things move, especially when communities are involved and communities have motivations to drive, again, making the pie bigger for everybody if that's at all possible. So enjoyed talking about this. Hope you enjoyed it as well. Always enjoy doing the Sunday Perspective shows with you. If you get a chance to rate the show on Apple Podcasts, we'd love to have it. I know we're seeing some more ratings here lately. And with that, I'll wrap up and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.